All of you, please mute yourselves. Yeah. Okay. Good evening, everyone. I think this meeting is being recorded as well. So, without much delay, let's start today's lecture. So today, we'll be talking about approach to glomerular diseases. See, kidney diseases basically can be approached in two ways, right? One is based on the chronology. Chronology, when I say based on the time span, like when we say acute kidney injury, we mean that the insult has happened within 7 days. Or when I say CKD, chronic kidney disease, it means that there has been a kidney pathology which has been ongoing since the past 3 months. So it's more than 3 months. Only then do you label someone as CKD. Then we have rapidly progressive renal failure, where it is in terms of days to weeks. That is when you call the rapidly rising PRF or rapidly progressive renal failure. One way of classifying renal pathology. The second approach, because they behave similarly, is to group diseases which affect a particular segment of the nephron. So what are the parts of a nephron? We have the glomerulus. The diseases which affect glomeruli are called as glomerular diseases. Then we have the tubules. We have proximal convoluted tubule, distal convoluted tubule, loop of Henle, whatever. So when we say tubular disorders, what are the tubular disorders like your Bartter syndrome, Gittelman's, all those, they are diseases which affect particularly tubules, certain RTAs. So they could be tubular disorders. So we have glomeruli, then we have the tubules. What is remaining? You have the interstitium, the space between two glomeruli. They are called as tubulo-interstitial because usually the diseases which involve tubules also involve the interstitium. So you have interstitial diseases or tubulo-interstitial disease. That is the third category. Then fourth one, we have the diseases which affect the vessels, like vascular disorders. It could be anything, right, from like TMA or renal artery stenosis, wherever the vessels are getting involved. Vessels, when I say arteries, arterioles, they are getting inflamed. Vasculitis. So that is another classification of diseases. These are like broadly divided: glomeruli, tubules, purely interstitium, or more often combining second and third, tubulo-interstitial diseases. And lastly, the diseases which involve the renal vessels. So these are the four compartments which are usually divided. Glomerular diseases are an important entity in our clinical practice. It is just that probably with our present setting, we are underdiagnosing. So I thought we'll just highlight how to go about glomerular diseases in today's class. First, let us see some basic aspects of glomerulus. Yeah. So why is a glomerulus called as a glomerulus in the first instinct? So glomus actually is derived, it is in Latin, means a yard ball. This on the picture on the right is a yard ball. Can you compare? This is an electron microscope view of the glomerulus. It appears very similar, right? So this is how, as a tuft of capillaries, glomerulus was so named, deriving its name from glomus. If you take a closer view, this is a electron microscopy view, a scanning electron microscopy view of the glomerulus. What you see here are all the tubules. Encompassing the tubules, this is the specialized epithelial cell. This is what is called as a podocyte. This podocyte sends in finger-like projections. See here, all these are finger-like projections. They are called as foot processes. So this is the basic structure of how a glomerulus is formed. There's a vessel here, then there is the podocyte here. If you take a cross-sectional view, this is also an electron microscopy view. This is the podocyte. See, this is the specialized epithelial cell. This is the podocyte. These has got these foot processes. Between the two podocytes, there is a gap where they interdigitate. See this here. This is where I'm pointing. Okay. So this space is called as a slit diaphragm. We will come to it eventually in a minute. This is the glomerular basement membrane, what is labeled as BM here. This inner part of it is the endothelial layer, the inside of the blood vessel. So here we have the endothelial cell layer. Then we have the glomerular basement membrane. And here we have the specialized epithelial cell, that is the podocyte. So if you see it in this view, these are the podocytes here. This is the glomerular basement membrane here. This is the endothelium and the blood vessel here. On the outer part, this is what we refer as the urinary space or the Bowman space. Remember this picture. Okay. So these three layers together are referred to as glomerular filtration barrier. Basically, what is the process of forming urine? There will be blood which are passing through the glomerular capillaries. This glomerular filtration barrier allows the passage of only certain substances into the urinary space. So from here to the urinary space, only certain elements are filtered out. Further, the tubules have a different mechanism of both secreting and absorbing things, and whatever is not required by the body is excreted as urine. So this glomerular filtration barrier forms the basis of many of our glomerular diseases pathology. If you see this cartoon, here we have a podocyte. So this is the glomerular basement membrane. This is the endothelial side or the endothelial cells. Okay. This is a closer view of what is there within the podocyte. Podocyte has got an actin cytoskeleton. This maintains the shape of the podocyte. This is the actin cytoskeleton. There are several channels, okay, from NEF1 to podocin-nephrin complex, CD2AP. You don't need to remember the names of these individual proteins. Basically, whenever one of these proteins malfunction or there is a mutation in one of these proteins, we end up with a dysfunction in the slit diaphragm. Normal slit diaphragm has got a space of around 40 nanometer. So it does not allow huge proteins to pass through it. In fact, very, very little of albumin or no albumin is let in through normally through slit diaphragm. Less than 30 mg albumin is let out per day. When the slit diaphragm malfunctions, there are many other proteins which will be easily able to pass through this. That is when you tend to have a proteinuria. So there could be congenital mutations which affect this. There could be other insults which cause a malfunction of these proteins, causing a leakage of proteins. That could be one mechanism. We'll just keep this picture in mind, and with this basic pathology, we'll go further. So what happens now that you all know what is glomerulus? The basic structure of a glomerulus, we have the podocyte, there is a glomerular basement membrane, below that we have the endothelial cells. What happens when there is an injury to the glomerulus? Glomerulus, just like us, has a typical set of responses as to how to respond to an injury. Suppose you get a scolding from someone, you have a typical set of responses, right? We tend to keep quiet if we are in a hostile situation, very common scenario. We don't respond, we just keep quiet. Or you can just get angry, you can shout back at the person, or you can leave the place, or you can cry. So you've got a certain response mechanism whenever there is an injury. Likewise, glomerulus has also got certain responses when it is exposed to injury. Injury could be in terms of antigen antibody complexes or complements coming and attacking the glomeruli, or it could be infectious agents. So whatever is the insult, glomerulus can respond usually only in 4 ways. What can it do? It can start leaking blood. Normally, it doesn't leak blood. You don't have any RBCs in the urine. through glomerular filtration barrier defect. So if it gets injured, it can leak blood. This can cause hematuria. The hematuria can be microscopic hematuria or it can be macroscopic hematuria. Then what can it do? It can leak protein. So once it starts leaking protein, it is called as proteinuria. That further leads to edema when it is chronic. There's hypoalbuminemia. You all know the Starling forces, how it works and how albumin keeps the fluid within the intravascular space. So whenever protein is being continuously lost, it further leads to edema. Then you can lose a certain part of the glomerulus. So that can lead to loss of filtration fraction. What do I mean by loss of filtration fraction? There are 100 glomeruli which are filtering. So out of that, say 20 of them get injured. They are not able to filter and produce the filtrate. The filtrate is the urine. So they lose 20 glomeruli. That is when 20 glomeruli, it may not cause a significant increase in creatinine. So out of 100 glomeruli today, 20 get damaged, tomorrow again 10, tomorrow again 10. So slowly what happens, because body is not able to filter creatinine, increase in serum creatinine will be noted. This is another type of response to glomerular injury. Lastly, it can cause hypertension. So, glomerulus or nephrons per se are involved in a key role in maintaining the blood pressure. So, either through a retention of salt and water because it is not able to filter as effectively as it could, or through the activation of renin mediated hypertension, it can cause secondarily hypertension. So these are the four responses to glomerular injury. What are they? They can cause hematuria, they can cause proteinuria, worsening renal failure, and hypertension. Now, depending on which mechanism predominates, this is what you're all used to saying, that it is a nephrotic presentation or a nephritic presentation, and somewhere in between you have nephrotic nephritic presentation. What do we mean when we say that there is nephrotic presentation is that the injury is primarily to the podocytes. You all saw the podocytes, right? So when the podocytes are injured, their architecture changes. That typical foot process and interdigitating process, all of them, they change. So that leads to proteinuria. So proteinuria of nephrotic range, we will come to the definition in a while, but nephrotic range proteinuria means that there is more than 3.5 grams per day of protein being leaked in the urine. The other spectrum, the other end is nephritic. Here it is more of inflammation. It is not just damage to podocyte. It is the inflammation which predominates. So inflammation can in turn lead to reactive cell proliferation. The glomerular basement membrane breaks. So when it breaks, there are a lot of RBCs which are let in. These are the diseases which predominantly manifest with hematuria. A severe variant of acute nephritic syndrome is what is called as RPGN, or rapidly progressive glomerular nephritis, where it is associated with crescents. We will come to RPGN and crescents in the next class. Based on whether it is nephrotic or nephritic, here we can see the diseases: minimal change disease, FSGS, membranous nephropathy, diabetic nephropathy. All these tend to predominantly present with proteinuria and edema. Whereas if you see post-streptococcal glomerular nephritis, PSGN, also called as PIGN, post-infectious glomerular nephritis, or more appropriately called as infection-related glomerulonephritis. Then we have the small vessel vasculitis, different vasculitic disorders, say HSP nephritis or many other vasculitis, anti-glomerular basement membrane diseases, IgA nephropathy to some extent. All these present predominantly with hematuria. The diseases can have a spectrum ranging from here to here. See, SLE has got a heterogeneous presentation. It can present from nephrotic syndrome to somewhere between nephrotic and nephritic, saying that there is some amount of proteinuria, but you can't classify typically as nephrotic. There is some hematuria. And on the other, it can also present in this spectrum like crescent formations and rapidly progressive renal failure type of picture, or acute nephritic syndrome. So SLE is here. It can present across the spectrum. IgA nephropathy is a little more towards the nephritic syndrome. Excuse me. IgA nephropathy is a little more towards the nephritic spectrum. It tends to have usually RBCs in urine, but can also present with some amount of proteinuria, hematuria. So this spectrum, just remember, it could be here, it could be here, it could be anywhere from between this, or like MPGN presenting somewhere with proteinuria and hematuria. Now, knowing that these are the basic glomerular diseases, this slide is not for completion. It's been simplified for covering only common diseases. Primary glomerular diseases means those glomerular diseases which tend to affect the glomeruli as a primary mechanism. There's no secondary pathology going on in the body. They are minimal change disease. FSGS is focal segmenting glomerulosclerosis. The other one is membranous nephropathy. They present as nephrotic syndrome usually, more so in the elderly. More so in the elderly. Some people refer to membranous nephropathy as also membranous glomerulonephritis. Don't get confused. Membranous glomerulonephritis is different from membranoproliferative glomerulonephritis. This is called as MPGN. This is abbreviated as MN or membranous nephropathy, sometimes called as MGN or membranous glomerulonephritis. This is a totally different entity from MPGN. Then we have got IgA nephropathy or Burgess disease. All these are primary glomerular diseases, meaning they affect the glomeruli as a primary mechanism. There is no systemic feature going on or primarily involving the kidney. Compare that to diseases, secondary glomeruli, where the insult is somewhere else, like diabetes or lupus. The disease is more widespread. Kidneys also get involved in the process of the pathogenesis of the disease. What diseases do we have here? We have diabetic nephropathy. There is lupus nephritis. Then there is vasculitis. There are different glomerular diseases associated with infections. These are the common things which you come across in our clinical work. So with that, let us see how to divide MPGN. Out of all these, I think MPGN requires a little bit further description, because MPGN basically just means a pattern of injury. Pattern of injury as in it is a histopathological pattern. There are slides towards the end. I'll show how MPGN looks like. But MPGN per se is not. If I say minimal change disease, it is a disease. Whereas when we say MPGN, MPGN is a group of disorders. It is just one common histopathological pattern of disease. MPGN has got further different diseases which can produce this common type of injury. That further division is basically dependent on the immunofluorescence, whether it stains in the IF only for immunoglobulins with or without complement, or there is a totally complement dominant type of MPGN, or whether it is negative for both IgG and C3. There's a case regarding MPGN. We'll come in detail to this slide in a while. But just remember, MPGN is not a diagnosis. For MPGN, you have to further work up to find out the etiology of the case. We'll leave it at that now. Now, when a patient clinically comes, what are the common manifestations they'll present with for you to pick up that probably I am dealing with glomerular disease is, first, you may have edema, and sometimes if the patient is intelligent enough, you may also pick up a history of frothy urine or foamy urine. This edema we already spoke about. This is because of proteinuria, protein being lost in the urine. Therefore, you have frothy urine or foamy urine. Also, edema, which could, proteinuria may not be the only pathophysiological mechanism. There could also be a salt and water retention, both of them contributing to edema. That is one. The second classic history is you get hematuria. Hematuria, if it is gross, they tend to describe the hematuria as cola-colored hematuria or smoky hematuria, the typical color. It is usually painless. Glomerular disease hematuria is usually a painless type of hematuria. There could be association with intercurrent illness. For example, with what do I mean by intercurrent illnesses? In IgA nephropathy, there is a certain association with prior respiratory or a gastrointestinal illness. Like the patient will say, I had diarrhea 2-3 days ago. Now, after that, I have developed reddish discoloration of urine. So this keeps happening every time. So maybe 2-3 months back, I had diarrhea, had this hematuria. It faded away. Then urine became normal color, did not seek medical attention. Further developed again certain infection, GI or respiratory, associated with the onset of hematuria. So that gives an important clue that something is triggering that hematuria. You may get that. That is one in IgA nephropathy. The second such link is with the post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis. You've got a skin infection or you've got a throat infection, following which there has been an onset of hematuria. This history, if you ask, sometimes you may get it. Microscopic hematuria is determined only on examination. The patient will not be able to complain of it. So gross hematuria, painless hematuria, cola-colored hematuria, association with intercurrent illness, all these point towards a glomerular disease, or at least in the initial, for you to think about a glomerular disease. Then, because of the loss of filtration fraction, we were telling how does the glomeruli respond to each injury. So one is I told you about protein leak. We told about blood leak. Here comes the loss of filtration fraction. What happens when the nephrons are not able to filter? Obviously, the urine output drops. That is what is called as oliguria. Oliguria is traditionally defined as less than 400 ml per day. When the renal failure becomes severe or is rapidly rising, they may also develop features of uremia, such as decreased appetite, nausea, vomiting, so on and so forth. So that is the third manifestation. Hypertension is usually picked up on examination, but if there is a rapid rise of blood pressure, like malignant hypertension, they may have certain features like occipital headache or blurring of vision or double vision, vomiting. So certain features which are related to hypertension, or most often it is presence as shortness of breath or dyspnea on exertion, having occipital headaches. So hypertension may sometimes give indirect clues on history that this patient may have glomerular disease. What do you need to ask further? These are basically to pick up that it is a glomerular disease. Once you pick up that it is a glomerular disease, you have to evaluate for the etiology, right? So what are the etiology? How do we look at a glomerular disease? Is you have to see, first thing is whether is it a multi-system disease or is it renal limited. Renal limited, we will be able to isolate a different set of conditions, whereas it is a multi-system disease. Say the patient along with this gross hematuria also has skin rash, malar rash, hair fall history, oral ulcers, then you will directly think of an SLE. This proteinuria edema is there. Patient is also a known diabetic for 5-6 years, has got poor glycemic control. Then you will think of diabetic nephropathy. So you should know what are the systemic manifestation. Or say vasculitis, the patient has got a typical vasculitic rash. All these systemic diseases give a clue as to what could be the likely glomerular etiology. Then, then we have the family history, elicit family history. If anyone else in the family has got similar complaints, say, do they have any inheritance of the disease, Alport's, or do they have like rare conditions? They can have familial IgA clustering. So ask if anyone else in the family has had a glomerular disease, has had any kidney diseases requiring dialysis. So that would also provide some sort of a clue. This is very, very important. Ask for recent intake of drugs. See, there are certain drugs which can trigger certain type of glomerular diseases. For example, NSAIDs and interferons can trigger minimal change disease. Then you have mercury. Mercury is present in all this cosmetic agents, skin lightening creams, etc. Or it could also be present sometimes in this native medications, Ayurvedic medications, or they tend to have heavy metals. So that can get deposited in the glomerular basement membrane and you have a membranous nephropathy. Heroin is known to stimulate an FSGS sort of illness. So knowing what drugs the patient has recently taken will also help you in concluding to some extent what is the glomerular disease. Insect bites, say bee stings, wasp bites, all these are known to trigger minimal change disease. That is why insect bites need to be asked for. Infections, you all know, streptococcal infections cause post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis. Common in children, still can occur in adults. Adults, it's more common, particularly in diabetics, to have a staphylococcal infection, followed by which to have a glomerulonephritic presentation. HIV can have a glomerular disease. It was what was previously called as HIV or HIV associated nephropathy. Then you have got COVID can also cause a glomerular disease. It's being now described as COVAN, C-O-V-A-N, COVID associated nephropathy. CMV, cytomegalovirus can cause glomerular diseases. So look for evidence of infections ongoing or in the recent past to see if the glomerular involvement is secondary to this particular infections. Malignancies can also have a glomerular presentation. You can have Hodgkin's disease or NHL, which triggers MCD. So these are the basic look into the etiological approach for you to come to some sort of conclusion as to which type of glomerular disease it could be there. Next, what do you examine the patient for? First is you do a general physical examination. What all to look for? Here you can see periorbital puffiness. You all know periorbital puffiness is slightly more specific to renal diseases. Even cardiac illness or hypoalbuminemia or liver involvement can also cause edema. But if you get a typical history of periorbital puffiness more in the morning, that goes in favor of renal involvement. Because of periodic hypoproteinemia, you can have these white bands. Can you see these white bands here? That is because of periodic manifestations of hypoalbuminemia. They are called as Murke lines. Okay, so there is a period when the nails are produced without albumin, that is when they have this white ridge. A period of normalcy when it is of the normal color. Again, a period of hypoalbuminemia. So these ridges could be present. Then examine the skin as we were speaking. See, this is the typical vasculitic rash. So if you see like this and the patient is having hematuria, straight away you can come to the diagnosis that the glomerulonephritis is secondary to the vasculitis. What vasculitis we'll have to further evaluate and find out. So this is the vasculitic rash. Or it could be more subtle, like this patient where there is a reticular sort of rash which you can see, and along with that if you have glomerulus involvement, and based of course you would need certain labs to confirm, you can come to the conclusion that there is a vasculitic process ongoing in the body. Okay, so we saw about history, what to ask, what are the manifestations of a glomerular diseases, how to identify the etiology, what to examine the patient for. Now we come to certain basic evaluation, the investigation part of it. So proteinuria, as I told, is a cardinal feature of glomerular dysfunction. Basically, there is a glomerular filtration which fails to work properly. So because proteinuria is likely an exam question, we'll go slightly in depth for proteinuria and hematuria. Normally, we should not excrete urinary protein of more than 150 milligrams. So our urinary protein per day is less than 150 milligrams. Of these 150 milligrams, less than 30 milligrams is albumin. The rest of it could be other proteins, but urine albumin is less than 30 milligrams per day under normal circumstances. So what constitutes the remaining protein is, you know that IgA is a secretory protein, small amounts of IgA, Tom Hosfall protein. These are the usual urinary proteins under healthy circumstances for an individual to excrete. How these proteins do not get filtered out is primarily because of the role of the glomerular filtration barrier. If we come back to this picture of the glomerular filtration barrier here. Yeah. So this is the glomerular filtration barrier, podocyte, glomerular basement membrane, and the endothelial cell layer. So this slit diaphragm does not allow proteins to pass. So slit diaphragm, as I told you, has got a diaphragm, the width is about 40 nanometer, 40 nanometer. So this does not allow proteins to pass through it. This is called as size selective barrier, meaning bigger molecules cannot pass through it. This is a size selective barrier. You should also use the terminology called as charge selective barrier. What do I mean by charge selective barrier is coating this podocyte is certain layer called as glycocalyx. So there will be a coating here that contains negatively charged proteins like heparin sulfate. So there will be a coating here that is the negatively charged particles. It tends to repel the proteins. Whichever comes near it, it will repel so that it can't come near this glomerular filtration barrier. Nevertheless, forget even passing through the slit diaphragm. So that is called as a charge selective barrier. So because of this size selectivity and the charge selectivity of it repelling the negative molecules, proteins are not normally let through the glomerular filtration barrier. Sorry. Yeah, so that is about the role of glomerular filtration barrier, charge and size selective filtration, how it happens. And you can write about the normal urinary protein excretion, urine albumin, and what is actually excreted. This is in health. In disease, what happens? Proteins start leaking when one of the either the slit diaphragms get damaged or the negative molecules are not able to repel the proteins. So based on how the proteinuria occurs, we have different types of proteinuria. One, we have the three typical ones are glomerular proteinuria, tubular proteinuria, and what is called as overflow proteinuria. What do I mean by glomerular proteinuria? Means the glomerulus is leaking proteins. This proteinuria usually tends to be of more than 2 grams. When it is of more than 3.5 grams, it is called as, all are per day, more than 3.5 grams per day, it is called as nephrotic range proteinuria. There could be other associated features of glomerular proteinuria. This glomerular proteinuria can further be subdivided into two types. It can be selective proteinuria or it can be non-selective proteinuria. Selective means it affects only for a particular type of protein to pass through. Say if I say selectivity for albumin, it is allowing only albumin to pass through, selective proteinuria. Non-selective proteinuria means it doesn't see whether it is albumin or whether it is some other protein, globulin, it just leaks all types of protein. So glomerular proteinuria can further get divided into selective and non-selective type of proteinuria. The importance comes in certain types of diseases, there is only albumin leakage, whereas in certain others, there could be both albumin and other proteins which are leaking. That is about glomerular type of proteinuria. Then we have the tubular proteinuria. Can tubules also cause proteinuria? How can tubules cause proteinuria could be the question. Say whatever small amounts of protein do get leaked into the urinary space and reach the tubules are further engulfed by the proximal convoluted tubules. They take up protein in an active endocytosis and return it back to the blood. When the tubuli get damaged, these tubular functions are affected and tubular range of proteinuria ensues. When I say tubular range of proteinuria, it is usually less than 1 gram, almost never exceeds more than 2 gram. Tubular range of proteinuria is usually less than 1 gram because tubules are not the primary mechanisms which prevent proteinuria. The primary mechanism, as I have been telling, is glomerulus. Proteinuria is usually to the tune of less than 1 to 2 gram in some conditions, almost never in more than 2 grams. Oh. Then the third type of proteinuria is what is called as overflow proteinuria. Overflow proteinuria is classical of diseases like multiple myeloma. What happens? There are a certain type of protein which gets produced in excess. So let's take up multiple myeloma. What happens? There is a particular clonal proliferation of certain types of chain. Let us say kappa light chain is getting produced in excess or lambda light chain is getting produced in excess. There's so much of kappa, they are all light chains, so they get secreted through the glomerulus. When they come into the tubules, normally tubules have a limit as to how much proteins it can absorb. Certain, okay, initially 5 grams come, the tubules absorb, but 10 grams start getting produced and further leakage into the tubules. It can't completely absorb the 10 grams. It is beyond its capacity. So what happens? The protein overflows the ability of the tubuli to absorb proteins. So whatever extra proteins which cannot be absorbed by the tubules start overflowing in the urine. This is called as the overflow proteinuria, very typical of multiple myeloma. They are called overflow proteinuria. Lastly, if there is certain damage anywhere in the part beyond the glomerulus, you have infections or stones, they can also cause leakage of small amounts of protein. That is how you get it in all this UTI. If you see, usually there along with pus cells, there will also be certain amount of protein leakage. Not that because of the infection, the glomeruli is not working or the tubules are not working. The infection per se can cause a certain amount of proteinuria. So these are the post-renal causes of proteinuria, usually seen in urinary tract infection and stones. So these are basically the 4 types of proteinuria. Now let us see how do we classify proteinuria. Proteinuria can be classified as normal or it could be moderately increased. Previously, this category was called as microalbuminuria. Now the terminology has changed. We call it moderately increased, or it could be severely increased. This category was previously called as macroalbuminuria. So these correspond to normal, microalbuminuria and macroalbuminuria. So this picture is from Brenner. So here they give the cutoffs as to different methods used in protein estimation. So AER is albumin excretion rate, PER is protein excretion rate. This is albumin creatinine ratio, PCR is protein creatinine ratio. Okay, so you may have seen reports where they give only albumin excretion rate or protein excretion rate. So that just says in 24 hours, how much of protein or how much of albumin is getting leaked. So normally I told you albumin should be less than 30. Normally protein is less than 150. If the albumin is 30 to 300 milligrams, this is called as moderately increased proteinuria. If the protein is 150 mg, proteins as total, here we are not speaking of only albumin, 150 to up to 500 milligram, it is called moderately increased proteinuria. Whereas an albumin of more than 300 or a protein of more than 500 milligrams are what are referred to as severely increased. Now with this we could have sufficed. But what happens is there is no parameter for a patient who has got normal functioning kidney. So albumin excretion is a function of the ability of the kidneys to filter, right? You have to compare it to something. Suppose a patient has got a normal creatinine 0.8. That patient's kidneys are functioning well and that patient has got a albumin excretion rate of say 350. So you will put that patient under this category. Whereas another patient, creatinine is 4. So that patient has got less number of nephrons. Basically, the number of nephrons which are working only are less. So that patient also, if you are comparing to this previous patient saying that it is of 150 milligrams, say the second patient has got a protein of 150 milligram, you can't compare the two patients because their renal function varies. There came in the concept of comparing the protein as a function of creatinine or albumin creatinine ratio, protein creatinine ratio, meaning for this much of protein is getting excreted for this much of creatinine excretion. So that gives an adjustment for the renal function per se. So because we use PCR more, for now keep ACR apart. PCR you can further based on whether this is milligram per gram is based on per gram of creatinine. Milligram per millimole is per millimole of creatinine. Leave this column. Milligram per gram of creatinine, based on that you can classify normal to mildly increased as less than 150, 150 to 500 or more than 500. Here what they are reporting when we send to labs are milligram per milligram. They see protein also is evaluated in milligrams, creatinine is also evaluated in milligrams per deciliter, and then they give the reports. So basically that is the concept. We will come to the normal ranges. When we do the protein reagent strip or the dipstick, it can get reported as negative to trace, which is normal. Trace to a single plus is usually moderate plus. See, dipstick is a semi-quantitative analysis. It can't absolutely quantify proteinuria, but provide some brief estimation as to where it can go. Anything 2 plus, 3 plus, 4 plus goes in this category. So these are the different methodologies and the common values for dividing proteinuria. Okay. This is clinically more useful than worrying about all those other things. We have nephrotic syndrome, we have nephrotic range proteinuria, and then we have the non-nephrotic range proteinuria. This is from KDIGO glomerulonephritis guidelines of, it's a public draft guidelines from June 2020, last year. So here what they say, when you have to say someone has got a nephrotic syndrome, more than 3.5 grams in 24 hours, or if in children, you may not be able to measure, so they have other measures. So just ignore it for the moment. So you have got more than 3.5 grams per 24 hours, along with hypoalbuminemia, edema, hyperlipidemia. So these entire group of features should be present for you to call it as nephrotic syndrome. Whereas if it is only proteinuria, without a decrease in albumin, without edema, with lipids being normal, then you call it just as nephrotic range proteinuria. Don't confuse nephrotic syndrome and nephrotic range proteinuria. Nephrotic range proteinuria means there are no other features suggestive of nephrotic syndrome. Only the protein leakage is in the nephrotic range. Here, nephrotic syndrome means you have concurrently other findings. Okay, so this PCR, when they are comparing it to milligram to gram, you have it as more than 3000. As I told you, we do milligram for milligram. So there you have more than 3. A PCR of more than 3, what we do clinically here, or a proteinuria 24 hours as you do more than 3.5 gram is what says it is a nephrotic syndrome or a nephrotic range proteinuria based on the corroboratory evidence. Whereas anything between 0.3 to 3.4 gram, I told up to 300 milligrams could be present, up to 150 actually. So for the purpose of clarity, it is 0.3 to 3.5 you can make. 0.3 to 3.4 in between, that is called as a non-nephrotic range proteinuria, subnephrotic range proteinuria. Some people call it nephritic range proteinuria, but a preferred terminology would be to say it is a non-nephrotic. It's either nephrotic or it is non-nephrotic range proteinuria. Okay. Then how do we measure protein? There are certain things which you will have to keep in mind when you are sending a lab sample for assessing for proteinuria. See, there are so many factors which affect proteinuria. If you do in the wrong timing, you may actually end up with a higher protein estimation or falsified estimation of protein leakage. Suppose the patient is having a concurrent urinary tract infection, or if the lady is having a menstruation ongoing, the protein estimation will grossly be abnormal in such situation. You should take care to prevent that. There is protein being measured after a high intensity exercise. Exercise increases protein excretion in the urine. Sorry. So that is another condition which you have to take care. Congestive cardiac failure. Here, congestive cardiac failure due to already defect in the albumin passage and the cardiorenal syndrome, what is ongoing, you will already be having protein leaking. So in such cases, if you are measuring protein, you will again tend to make mistakes. So there is another entity called as postural proteinuria. So when they are awake and upright, the protein tends to be more. So if they are sleeping and you take the first morning sample, this postural proteinuria will not be there. So the first sample in the morning, if you collect, this will be negated. So basically, based on the posture, based on the urinary tract infection, hematuria, based on how much protein I'm taking. So today, if I eat, say, like more than my required quantity of protein, or people who go to this gym, they want to have a bodybuilding exercise, so they take in a lot of whey protein. That extra protein gets synthesized and filtered. So high intensity exercise, CCF, menstruation, drugs, all these affect urinary protein or albumin. Okay. Then the second type is how do we measure the proteinuria? Like what sample are we sending? So what sample are we sending also hugely affects. One is the 24-hour urinary protein. That is a gold standard by all parameters. In the normal resting conditions, if you can collect a 24-hour urine protein, that is the best estimate of measuring protein. Because of difficulty in measuring a 24-hour urine protein, or on follow-up each time for a glomerular disease patient, you cannot tell them to keep coming back with protein. We do something called as spot PCR. So just get a protein, simultaneously they will measure creatinine, they give a protein creatinine ratio. Based on that, you can subdivide. Then you have something called as timed PCR. Timed PCR is slightly better than urine spot PCR, but lesser than 24-hour urine protein. What it means is you time it, say 8 o'clock to 12 o'clock. So that is 4 hours, or 8 o'clock to 2 o'clock. So your timing, in that time you collect all the urine, in that time you calculate the protein in the urine and creatinine. It is not the 24 hours entire thing. In 6 hours, how much of urine has been passed is collected in a can. Slightly more convenient than 24-hour urine protein, but still better reliable compared to urine spot PCR. This technique is commonly used in children because 24-hour urine protein becomes very difficult in children. So timed PCR. Then of course you have the dipstick, the instantaneous one. The dipstick, these are the brief correlates. We were talking about how dipstick is a semi-quantitative method. Negative means there is less than 15 milligrams per deciliter of protein. Trace means 15 to 30, 1 plus is 30 to 100, 2 plus is 100 to 300, 3 plus varies between 300 to 1000, 4 plus means more than 1000 milligrams per deciliter. So these are the different types of proteinuria based on the dipstick. Okay. So this I already told. Once you collect, these are the different methods as to how proteinuria can be estimated. It could be chemical method, turbidimetric, dye binding. Don't worry about all these. Just remember there are 3 different methods in the lab. One is chemical, wherein you add a particular reagent. Turbidimetric method means there is an antibody against the protein which is used. Dye means one particular dye which is added changes the color based on how much of protein is present. So there are different methods. The most specific one and which is being commonly used presently is turbidimetric. You may have seen reports. It says SBAX reagent, then it says by immunoturbidimetric method. Don't worry about SBAX. Use the immunoturbidimetric method of proteinuria measurement. So that is about proteinuria. What you should write about proteinuria is how proteinuria is normally prevented in health. What is the normal range of proteins? In diseases, what are the different types of proteinurias? Then you can write about briefly about collection methods, where it will be falsely high, and how methods of proteinuria are measured. If you still have times on proteinuria measurement, you can further subdivide into glomerular diseases, tubular diseases. Write a small note on glomerular diseases, tubular diseases. How proteinuria acts as a measure of controlling the glomerular disease. It prevents progression of renal function. The therapeutic aspects of proteinuria control by adding an ACE or ARB in this thing will come in the management part of glomerular diseases. So this is in brief about proteinuria. Let us quickly go through, okay, we are way short of time. Let us quickly go through hematuria. Hematuria is defined as more than 3 RBCs per high power field in a centrifuged urine sample. See, why I put a reference is different textbooks give different references. Some textbooks say more than 3 RBCs per high power field in males, whereas more than 5 RBCs in women. Some books usually say more than 5 RBCs for everyone, but this is the most accepted definition. More than 3 RBCs per high power field. Remember high power field, and it has to be a centrifuged urine sample. Okay, so these 3 terminologies have to come in. This is hematuria. This hematuria can further be divided into one. It can be divided whether it is a glomerular hematuria or a non-glomerular hematuria. That is one. Second, it can also be divided into transient hematuria or persistent hematuria. Transient hematuria means where it is only a one-time affair. So urinary tract infection or there was a strenuous exercise, had hematuria, over. But if there is a persistent hematuria, what do I mean by persistent hematuria? Present in 3 urinary samples. So that is when you will have to evaluate. That can be further subdivided based on the location of the bleeding. So if you consider this is the kidney, the ureter, the bladder, the urethra. So the cause of bleeding can be anywhere from here to here. So when it is here, you have the glomerular causes. Apart from the glomerulus in the kidney, you also have interstitium causes you can have, or you can have certain infective etiologies. Then when you come down here, you can have ureteral blocks or trauma, which can cause bleeding from can cause bleeding. Urethral inflammation, urethritis or stones or whatever pathology here can cause hematuria. So again, further, if you want to go further in detail, you can classify it on age base as shown in this picture. This is from Oxford textbook of nephrology, saying whether classified as less than 40 years. This should have been more than 40 years. Sorry for the typo. So this is more than 40 years. So more than 40 years when they present with hematuria, the only thing for practical purpose which you have to remember is malignancy comes up high on the list. If you person who is older and is having hematuria, malignancy comes up higher in the list. Whereas in the less than 40 years age, you go have the traditional things. You have glomerular involvement, like we saw that picture. Diseases which tend to have a nephritic presentation, such as IgA nephropathy, thin basement membrane disease, SLE, sometimes all glomerular causes are high up. Then you have interstitial nephritis, infections. In fact, UTI is one of the commonest cause of hematuria, whether it is bacterial UTI, viral or fungal UTI. Infections can cause hematuria. Not that all hematuria is directly glomerular disease. We'll see what are the clues to glomerular hematuria. Then you can have in the ureters calculi, trauma, cyst being present, ADPKD, then certain vascular insult like sickle cell disease, infections, all these can also cause hematuria. In the ureter, of course, strictures can also cause, bladder cystitis can cause, urethritis, malignancy, so on and so forth. These are some of the causes of hematuria. But if you are saying glomerular hematuria, how do we make out it is a glomerular hematuria based on simple examination findings? So when you send for RBCs, so many times they report that there are dysmorphic RBCs present. So what do we mean by dysmorphic RBC? Abnormal morphism. It is not of the normal morphology. So here you can see this is what are the dysmorphic RBCs. Dysmorphic RBCs are a broad group, meaning it could be any shape. What one shape which you are seeing here is some one projection. This is called a thorn-like projection. This is the typical acanthocyte. This is the RBC which is present in the urine. The technique of identifying these RBCs in urine is called as phase contrast microscopy, meaning they use a contrast to highlight these dysmorphic RBCs. The name acanthocyte is derived from the Latin word acantha. Acantha means a thorn. Okay, so that is what is an acanthocyte. So you have got a thorn-like projection. These are very specific of glomerular disease. When the RBC passes through the glomerulus, its shape gets distorted when it is passing through the glomeruli. That is why you tend to have dysmorphic RBCs. Or you can have something like this. Can you see this picture here? It looks like a donut, right? This is the donut shaped RBC. This is also a dysmorphic RBC. This is also a dysmorphic RBC. Like that, there could be different dysmorphic RBC. Just saying dysmorphic RBCs does not mean anything. The percentage of dysmorphic RBCs out of total RBCs have to be established. Now, different books give different cutoffs. So here they say that out of the total RBCs, if 50 to 80% are dysmorphic, then you can call it as a glomerular range. This is from the KDIGO guidelines. You can use this. There are other books which reduce this cutoff to 30. So 30 to 80%, anywhere between 30 to 80% if you have dysmorphic RBCs, that is what goes in favor of a glomerular disease. Just 5%, 8% or without percentage if you are seeing, then it doesn't mean anything. Ideally, in ideal situation, you should have an estimation of the percentage. One. Or as I told you, this acanthocytes, they are a little more specific compared to other types of dysmorphism. So an acanthocytes, even if you can make out acanthocytes of more than 5%, that per se can be used as an independent indicator for saying that this is a glomerular disease. All right. So this is about what is dysmorphic RBCs and how to measure dysmorphic RBCs. And this is the reference for the above statement. So now with this, we come to different clinical presentations of glomerular diseases. After this, you all already know the syndromic classification. So glomerular diseases can present in any one of these syndromes. Asymptomatic that is only when the patient is examined for something else and they pick up incidentally proteinuria, hematuria. Macroscopic hematuria, we spoke in depth. Nephrotic syndrome, we spoke in depth. Nephritic syndrome is a combination of oliguria, hematuria, proteinuria along with hypertension. Then we can have RPGN, CGN. CGN means basically they present in the end stage format. So the patient is already, closer to dialysis or has lost a significant amount of filtration fraction. Hypertension, clinically edema. If you do ultrasound scanning, you may not be able to biopsy it already because the kidneys are shrunken smooth kidneys. So your glomerular disease presentation can be anywhere here. The advantage is if you pick up the patient here in the anywhere before it reaches the CGN, either in the asymptomatic, macroscopic, nephrotic, nephritic or RPGN, you will be able to halt the progression. Once you diagnose it properly, there are certain therapeutic maneuvers either to reduce proteinuria or specific immunosuppressive treatment like steroids or cyclophosphamide or whatever. What is our goal? We have to delay or postpone or stop the progression of the glomerulonephritis. You have to prevent the patient from going into a dialysis dependency stage. See, a good nephrologist, it is not like how many dialysis, okay, I've done 10 dialysis today or 20 dialysis today. Giving dialysis is the easiest thing on earth, right? The patient is in end stage, declare end stage and start him on dialysis. But if you can prevent a dialysis, that is what shows that you are a better clinician. You should prevent a patient from reaching a dialysis stage. So you have to intervene and pick it up at this particular stage. Okay, with that, we'll go to some specific serological workups to help us further subdivide the types of glomerular diseases. Basically, you need a protein estimation, protein quantification, hematuria, whether it is a glomerular hematuria to say that if you have a dysmorphic RBC facility, that is well and good. If they can give the percentage of dysmorphic RBCs, that is excellent. So those are the basic workup. What additional workup do you need? You need to do complements. Why do we need to do complements? See, just concentrate on these three pathways. This is the complement pathway. I'm sure all of us have forgotten the complement pathway. So this is the classical pathway. Then we have the lectin pathway. Then we have the alternative pathway. So based on what is the inciting agent, PAMs and DAMs, do you all remember from second year pathology? This is basically certain molecular prints which can trigger these pathways. So the classical pathway, what you have to remember is C1 is involved, C2, C4 are also involved. C1 is exclusive for classical pathway. See, C1 is not getting involved in lectin or in alternative pathway. C1 is specific for classical pathway. Whereas when there is C2, C4 involvement, it could be either classic or it could be either lectin pathway. Common pathway is C3. Here, sorry. So here you can see C3. So C3 getting affected means it can either be alternative pathway or it can be the combined classical and lectin pathway. So what happens when you measure C3 and C4 in combination is if only C3 is affected and C4 is normal. See, C3 is not only affected, C4 is normal, means we are likely dealing with the pathology which has come through the alternative pathway. If C3 is decreased, but C4 is also decreased, simultaneous decrease in C3 and C4, it could be one of either classical or lectin pathway. We don't have presently assess, we don't have, meaning we don't normally clinically do. If you want, you can still do, but clinically we don't commonly do C1. But in biopsies, we'll be able to identify C1. So if you have a pathway which is involving exclusively C1, straight away you can say it is a classic pathway involvement. Or if you have C3, C4 involvement, you can tell that it is classic and lectin pathways involved. Now, why should we bother and break our heads so much is based on which type of disease, which type of complement gets affected, we can roughly divide the glomerular diseases. So basically glomerulonephritis, complements can be affected, complements need not be affected. You can have C3, C4 totally normal. So when you have normal complement, C3, C4, normal means you have to think of these 4 diseases: IgA nephropathy, HSP, that is Henoch-Schönlein purpura, anti-GBM disease, and ANCA vasculitis. Further subdivision among these 4 pathologies will be by immunofluorescence. Immunofluorescence is a renal biopsy technique wherein certain greenish fluorescent light is used to light up certain components. So in ANCA, it will be fluorescent negative, whereas all 3 other things, there will be fluorescence will be positive. Let us not go so much. We'll just briefly keep it at the discussion sake here: IgA nephropathy, HSP, anti-GBM. Okay. When you have low complements, you have to divide them whether you have only low C3, as I was saying, where it is likely to be predominantly alternative pathway involvement. There you have post-infectious glomerulonephritis, C3 glomerulopathy, or shunt nephritis. When you have both low C3 and C4, it means that your first 2 pathways are affected, meaning classical or lectin. Classical pathway, the disease which we are thinking of is lupus. So very high in the list is lupus nephritis. And MPGN is a group of diseases. Certain infections, all of them, lupus, everything come under MPGN. There they have both low C3 and C4. So for us to come into this concept as to give differential diagnosis, now as we go on working up glomerulonephritis, we have to identify what is the etiology, right? So for us, complement is an important tool in that regard. Then you require ANA. This is because many of them are associated with autoimmune diseases, say lupus or Sjogren's or whatever, you need an ANA. Initially, you can do screening by ELISA and a complete profile by Western blot later. That can be done once the screening is positive. Most of the cases, screening by ELISA method in the initial workup stages is sufficient. Then whenever you are suspecting ANCA, like your C3, C4 is normal, there is RPRF, then you can do ANCA. ANCA involves 2 further subtypes. It is called as PR3 and MPO ANCA. Earlier it was being referred to as C ANCA and P ANCA. Now it is kept apart. What is used is PR3 ANCA and MPO ANCA. So that ANCA and its utility will come to it in the RPGN class. Then sometimes anti-GBM antibodies you can measure. Anti-GBM meaning anti-glomerular basement membrane antibodies. So antibodies which are formed against the glomerular basement membrane. Because a lot of infections can present as glomerular diseases, you need to do also the viral markers. This will complete the workup of a glomerular diseases. Once you have identified, elicited history, and are working up in the direction, this is what initial workup is required. Now, after doing all these things, even at this stage, we will not be 100% sure as to what is the disease. So for that, the gold standard in diagnosing a glomerular diseases is kidney biopsy. Kidney biopsy is required for the diagnosis of any type of glomerular disease. Kidney biopsy is the gold standard, right? Kidney biopsy is not done. You may ask me, then do we do kidney biopsy for all glomerular diseases? By and large, yes. For any type of glomerular disease, to prove which type you have to do, to prognosticate, meaning how this patient will behave. So there are 2 different patients having lupus. One is having a 0.8 creatinine, someone is having 1.3 creatinine. So do they behave similarly? No. If you do a kidney biopsy, you may see chronicity in the person who is having a creatinine of 1.3. Chronicity means the disease has been present for a long time. There are some changes which are produced in the kidney which may not be reversible by the treatment you give. So both for diagnostic and prognostic. To prognosticate a patient means, you know, right, how do they behave in long term? You need biopsy. Even to assess efficacy of a treatment. So this is a case of minimal change disease. I have started steroids. Somehow the patient is not responding. So if to efficacy of the treatment to assess also, you may need a biopsy sometimes. So biopsy is the gold standard. So that cannot be emphasized enough. But if you ask me, other instances where it can be diagnosed without biopsy, there are very few. See, very few in the sense where one, you have got a less invasive technique for diagnosing that particular glomerular disease. Where do I've got a less invasive technique? If you go back to that original chart, or if you remember that, primary glomerular diseases we were talking, I told about membranous nephropathy. Okay, membranous nephropathy in the past decade, between 2009 and 2019, there have been multiple what to say, antigens which can be detected in the blood. So you have got one of them is PLA2R, or antiphospholipase A2 receptor. So that if you measure and if you get it as positive and the patient doesn't have any other risk factors, you can reasonably conclude that this patient has got a primary membranous nephropathy and straight away start treatment. That is one instance. Second is in diabetic nephropathy. Diabetic nephropathy is a very common disease, right? We don't keep biopsying every diabetic we see. We just say it is presumed DKD or presumed diabetic kidney disease, likely DKD. You must have seen notes and everywhere. There are a certain features as to say how diabetic nephropathy behaves. Usually poor glycemic control. There will be diabetic retinopathy. The concordance rate is somewhere around 70 to 80%. Then there will be progression of diabetic nephropathy from the stages of normal albuminuria to moderately increased albuminuria to severely increased albuminuria. You don't all of a sudden one day directly end up in severely increased albuminuria. So it has gone through those stages. There are less or very few RBCs. Kidneys are of normal size. All these indicate that it is likely diabetic nephropathy. So in such diseases where you have got a less invasive technique to diagnose that particular disease, like PLA2R for membranous nephropathy, or for diabetic kidney disease, where based on history and certain other features, you can reasonably conclude that this is diabetic nephropathy. In such cases, you need not do a biopsy. But excluding that, they are far and few. But excluding that, almost all patients require a kidney biopsy for the diagnosis of glomerular diseases. These are in other two in children, where because steroid sensitive nephrotic syndrome is very common in children, or PSGN is very common and it has got a very good prognosis. You can easily treat rather than going through the biopsy. In such condition, the risk of biopsy is more compared to the benefit of biopsy. Everything in medicine is the dilemma between risk benefit, right? So if you feel the invasive procedure is risk and it is more easily treated, only in such condition you can avoid biopsy. But for your information, adult onset nephrotic syndrome, all adult onset nephrotic syndromes, they need to undergo a biopsy. They need to have a glomerular disease established, and your treatment is tailored according to the glomerular disease which you find on the renal biopsy. Okay. So now this is how renal biopsy looks like. This is a PAS stain. This is just for orienting yourselves. That's all before we go on to the cases. This is the glomerulus, a blown up image. What you're seeing is the tubules here. These are the back-to-back arrangement of the tubules. What is labeled as CL are the capillary loops. Okay. This is the Bowman's space or the urinary space. If you continue through this, then you will have the proximal convoluted tubule and the urine forms and drains. What is supporting the capillary loops in between these things, they are called as the mesangial cells. Okay, this is for orientation. Now with that, we move on to the cases. I think now we all already know the cases, but still I would expect some volunteers to come up so that we'll quickly go through the cases and finish. Anyone wants to volunteer? Awake? All of you are awake or slept off? If you all don't volunteer, then I'll have to call out someone. We'll call Ananta Krishna is here.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Will you take up this case? Read out. Can you see the slide?
Yes, ma'am.
Read out and tell me what you would have done if this patient has come to you.
19-year-old girl, BCom
Ha.
student,
Ha.
fetal edema of 2 months,
Okay.
normal sensi, urine
Ha.
protein is 3 plus proteinuria,
Ha.
and creatinine is 0.83.
Okay, don't get biased. If she had come to you when you were there in emergency doing duty, what will you do for this girl? Any examination, any investigation, you can tell me how you want to go about this case.
Nephrotic range of proteinuria in an young girl.
How did you know it is nephrotic range proteinuria?
3 plus.
See, you have only have an albumin 3 plus, right? For you to say nephrotic range proteinuria, you have to quantify it first.
Yeah, 24-hour urine protein we will get it.
You want a 24-hour urine protein. Okay, then what else do you want? That's all. Is it kidney first of all, or is it something else? This albumin 3 plus creatinine is normal.
Yeah. Normal routine LFT we will look like what is the if we to rule out it is means kidney will we normal means LFT if it is normal we will look the we will look for lipid if means lipid profile if it is hyperlipidemia is there or not.
So you want to see whether it is nephrotic syndrome or not. That is the first thing. See, not everything will be kidney. Just because I am talking about kidneys, not every patient who comes to emergency with pedal edema will be having a kidney disease, right? Everything, she could be having a totally different disease altogether. So these are the second line. Go step by step, don't jump. You wanted LFT. LFT serum albumin is 1.09. The rest all AST, ALT, everything is normal. You wanted lipid profile. She has elevated triglycerides with normal cholesterol, and viral markers are negative. You wanted 24-hour urine protein also, no? So 24-hour urine protein, you asked her to collect. She collected 400 ml volume of urine, and the protein is 395 milligrams per day. Yeah. Hello?
Yes, hello.
So what are you thinking? You can think aloud. Is this nephrotic syndrome? You can tell whatever you're thinking. Is nephrotic syndrome, not nephrotic syndrome? I don't know. Or I'm thinking it is nephrotic syndrome, but there is some features odd. Anything.
Some but the 24-hour urine protein is.
Yeah, so you don't have 24-hour urine protein should have been what if it was nephrotic range proteinuria?
More than 3.5.
More than?
24-hour urine protein, if it was nephrotic range, it must have been higher, like 3.5 gram, more than 3.5 gram per day. It must.
Yes, so if you had to say it is nephrotic range proteinuria, she should have had more than 3.5 grams, right? So that is where you should see how it was collected. So this patient, I think what I've already told this multiple times, there was a suboptimal collection of 24-hour urine protein. This usually happens. You see the patient in rounds, advise them to get a 24-hour urine protein, collect can and do it. But what happens was this patient was also having simultaneously, she was having diarrhea. She was not able to collect 24-hour urine. It's very difficult to collect 24-hour urine when you're also simultaneously having a gastroenteritis. One. Second, she was already on enalapril. That was the thing. So whatever, or the patient may just forget some 2-3 times. Okay, they've asked us to collect. Whenever I remember, I'll collect it in the can. And sometimes they have just passed it in the washroom. So this 24-hour urine protein was not truly the 24-hour urine sample. Okay, so how to make out whether it is really 24-hour or not is roughly, you can look at the creatinine. Healthy people like you and me, we should have, this is the creatinine excretion. So suppose someone is 60 kg, some lady has the urine creatinine per day should be somewhere 600 milligrams. Let us assume this girl's weight was some 50 kg. So her urine creatinine should have been at least 15 to 10 is 500 milligram. But how much creatinine have you got here? You have got 316 milligrams only. That means that this is a suboptimal collection. The collection is not okay. The volume is less. The creatinine is less. Therefore, the protein is also less. If we had collected for 24 hours in proper scenario, we may have got a different value, or we may not. I don't know what would have been the value. We couldn't repeat the test. But basically, this girl, that was the issue. The urine protein estimation was not up to the mark. When you're looking at the reports, you should also see how well it has gone to the lab. Okay. So next, you wanted C3, C4. You didn't ask me anyway. I only gave you the values. C3 is 15. C4 is less than 8. What is your interpretation, Ananta Krishna? Normal? Is it normal? You don't know the normal values of C3, C4, right? C3 normal is 90. Okay. C4 is the normal values are 10. The usual cutoff is at 10. So both C3 and C4 are reduced. If a patient has got, is this patient a glomerular disease? First thing.
It can be glomerular deposition.
Don't use words generally which we are not aware of. Don't use glomerular deposition. Deposition diseases are different. So we will just keep it simple. We'll say glomerular disease, tubular disease, vessels involved, like that. Okay. So is it kidney? First thing. You said it is probably kidney. Then we wanted to evaluate how much protein and some albumin and elevated cholesterol, elevated triglycerides are all there. Do you think this is glomerular disease, or do you think this could still be tubular disease? What is your thinking? Or do you want to know anything else?
Ma'am, as we don't know the correct proteinuria, but the clinical features with edema and hyperlipidemia, we can think of a more of a glomerular disease.
Very good. Yeah. So edema is there clinically, yes. And because she has got a low albumin and proteinuria, that is a plus minus report, even we couldn't interpret it. And particularly because the complements are low, we are thinking in terms of a glomerular diseases. Tubular disorders, there won't be complements, will be normal. Tubular disorders will not have a low C3, low C4 and all. So we are dealing with a glomerular disease. Which glomerular disease do you want to consider if you have low C3, low C4?
Lupus, NUH.
You already know the diagnosis. Is it lupus and which else? What else?
In others, but in
You want to see this? Yeah. So which are the diseases with low C3, low C4?
lupus and membranous proliferative glomerulonephritis.
Yeah, so you have got only two diseases, lupus and MPGN. So how do you differentiate between lupus and MPGN?
MPGN, you will have hematuria, features are there, and also
MPGN is a group of disorders. So don't worry about MPGN. See, when you're trying to differentiate what is easy for you to clinically look for, you should look at what is clinically easy. Is lupus clinically easy to look at, or lupus easy to evaluate? How do you evaluate to see if the patient is lupus or not?
clinical, other clinical.
Yes, other clinical features you will look for. This patient had some history of polyarthralgia, multiple joint pain for 2 months. But apart from that, clinically, no hair loss, no rash, no oral ulcers, nothing else to suggest that it was lupus. Then what else do you do? Any investigations you can do?
To rule out.
I'm not able to hear you.
And peripheral smear and CBC to rule out any pancytopenia, means like any
Okay, hematological manifestations of lupus. Okay, fine. She did not have pancytopenia. Then
ma'am, drug abuse history also, like it can be even drug induced lupus kind of thing also.
drug induced, we don't know it is lupus only in the first instance. We are still trying to see whether it is lupus or MPGN. What drugs can cause lupus? Okay, how do we confirm lupus?
Ma'am, firstly, ANA screening we will do, and if at all, if ANA screening comes positive, and also clinical scoring we must do.
Yeah, so ANA screening we did, ANA was positive.
And if the ANA screening is positive, we will do the clinical scoring, and if it is more than 10, we will consider it as.
Which clinical scoring? How many clinical scorings do you know for lupus? Good, you're
Ma'am,
doing well. I'm not discouraging you. You tell me the different clinical scoring for lupus. They are one thing you have to remember. They are all for diagnosing lupus. They are not for diagnosing lupus nephritis. So we are still in general lupus. We have not yet come down to the kidney. So different scoring systems for lupus.
Ma'am, SLICC was used before now, but
Which one?
SLICC criteria was
SLIC, SLICC. Okay.
but now it is like clinical. They have also included fever in the clinical criteria. So it will like every clinical
What is the
criteria.
name of the newer criteria? We should ask some seniors, I think, who are up to date. Anyway, the newer one is the ACR EULAR criteria. American College of Rheumatology and EULAR have come out with another criteria. So, do you want to do any further once ANA is positive? Anything more specific in the autoimmune antibodies? Do you want to do anything else?
ANA blot test can be done.
Yeah, this is the blot. I should have taken a picture of the blot. Okay, anyway, what all are positive?
I can't see.
You can't see it.
ESDNA is positive. Histone is strongly positive, and Smith is negative. That.
So is it lupus now? Agree or disagree?
ESDNA is specific and sensitive for lupus, and
Yes,
also
yes.
it's more means it shows prognostic and diagnostic value for lupus nephritis. Also, DSDNA is having, but Smith is more specific for lupus. It is negative, though, but still but histone is also positive.
So, what is your final interpretation?
Lupus nephritis versus either drug.
We are still in lupus. Don't go ahead. We have not yet reached lupus nephritis. We are still at lupus. A patient. The question is whether patient has lupus or no lupus.
Yes, ma'am. If patient has lupus, it may be SLE or maybe.
Yeah. So both dsDNA and Smith need not.
Smith, yeah.
dsDNA alone is also acceptable. Okay.
But histone was also strongly positive.
Can you tell me the SLIC criteria?
Ma'am, SLIC criteria means clinical criteria. There will be, ma'am, new criteria, ma'am, old SLIC. There will be rash, malar rash, discoid rashes. Then
for the benefit of everyone will do one thing. Will you post the SLIC criteria in the group? You will read up and post.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
SLIC and ACR you will post.
ACR. ACR I have.
Okay, just find out both. You will make a note and you will post it in the group today. Okay. So this patient, after this, we were also thinking of lupus nephritis. She underwent a kidney biopsy. On the left side is a normal looking glomerulus, because I know we are all not trained to looking at pathology pictures. You are all after second year only now probably looking at pictures. This is only for remembering. Okay, you won't be asked in practical exam to identify or whatever. Can you tell me what is different between this picture and this picture, Ananta Krishna?
Diffused and membrane involvement.
Now just tell what is, you're seeing lot of pink, lot of blue. Here also there is pink and blue. Everything will be pink and blue in histopathology. So what extra things or what is abnormal in this? Are they looking similar to you?
No, ma'am, more thick.
What is more thick?
More mesangial involvement.
Yeah, so this is the mesangium. Okay, so this is mesangium. See, this is the mesangium here. If you see mesangium here, there are only two cell layers. This is next to each other. When you're counting the cells in mesangium, you have to go one above the other. So anywhere you see here, there are only two cells which are one above the other. Here there is one, here there is one, here even if you count this and this, it is two. So when you use the term mesangial proliferation, there should be 3 or more cell layers in the mesangium. Count here 1, 2, 3 here, this line, and 4. Okay, so count here 1, 2, 3, 4. So actually you can count up till here also. This is a definite mesangial proliferation where you are seeing more than 3 cell layers in the mesangium. That is mesangial cellularity, mesangial hypercellularity. That is the terminology used. So there is definitely mesangial hypercellularity. Mesangium is like the intervening substance between the capillary loops. So this is the mesangial hypercellularity. What else are you saying?
No.
Okay. What else? Anything abnormal here?
Thrombus.
What is that? Some pink thing, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so basically this is within the capillary lumen. 1 second. So these are the capillaries. Okay, this is the capillary lumen. Here also within the capillary lumen, if you see carefully, you can see this pink thing. Pink is usually described as eosinophilic. Here you see these are the capillaries. It is clear. This is clear. This is clear. Capillary loops are usually red towards the periphery. It's clear. It's clear. So compared to that, there is something within eosinophilic material within the capillary lumen. Here also you are seeing this eosinophilic material. These are called as hyaline bodies, okay, or sometimes referred to as hyaline thrombi. So these are very pathognomonic of lupus nephritis. They are seen only in 2% cases of lupus nephritis, but when they are present, this is the only specific feature which can tell you that this patient has got lupus nephritis. All this mesangial proliferation, next slide will be showing you wire loop lesions. They can be present in multiple other diseases also. But hyaline thrombi is a specific feature of lupus nephritis. Okay. Now concentrate on this part. Here is what is your thickening of the basement membrane. Maybe next one will be better. See, if you see here, this part is thickened, right? So this thickening is called as wire loop lesions. This is another feature of lupus nephritis. This thickening is it is basically a subendothelial deposits of the immune complexes. The name wire loop came from this object. This is used by microbiologists to plate cultures wire loop lesions. This is the subendothelial immune complexes. Wire loop lesions are high probability of being seen in lupus, but it is not a specific lesion for lupus. It can also be seen in other diseases like HIV, cryoglobulinemia, all those diseases. Wherever there is subendothelial deposits, wire loop lesions will be seen. One of the differential diagnoses is lupus. Now, last slide for this patient. What is the difference between, this is a normal slide, this is the abnormal slide. So any difference between these two? What can you see here? There's a lot of proliferation, right? First of all, you can see the one thing when you're looking at the glomerulus, you look at the glomerular architecture. This looks like that proper tuft of capillaries, which we were seeing initially. Now see, it is all divided into certain like one segments. That is what is called as the membranoproliferative pattern. This is the lobular accentuation, actually called as. So you can see that the glomerulus has been divided into multiple lobules. Can you see this intermittent white gaps dividing it into different lobules? So this is what is called as the lobular accentuation of the glomerulus. This is how it is normally supposed to look. You are able to split it into different lobules. One. Then if you take a closer look, you will have a double basement membrane. So these two are characteristic features of a MPGN pattern. When I say MPGN pattern, you should remember this slide. MPGN pattern means that there is lobular accentuation, meaning that the glomeruli is divided into different lobules, and the is duplication of glomerulus basement membrane. Sorry, I'm not able to put other slides for GBM. Since those slides only I wanted to put, I had a positive of time today. I couldn't edit the presentation. I'll post better pictures in the next class. Maybe you can appreciate a little more. Duplication of glomerular basement membrane means there will be 1 GBM. See, like here, there is 1 GBM. When the injury occurs, the glomerulus responds to the injury. It produces another layer of glomerular basement membrane over and above the other one. So you have got a second layer will come here. Then what happens? The injury continues, no treatment. The glomerulus again will produce one more layer of glomerular basement membrane. That is called as duplication of glomerular basement membrane. It is better made out in different stains, in silver stain. So next class I'll show you that different stains and making out the MPGN pattern. Basically, this was put into see the MPGN pattern of the disease. Okay. So this was the what we were talking about, immunofluorescence. This is the normal panel which we are all do for all biopsies. For all renal biopsies, this entire panel is done. This is read as positive. This is read as negative. Okay. So now in lupus, the classic feature is all are positive. That is called as a full house pattern, meaning IgM is positive, IgG, IgA, C1q, kappa, lambda, C3, everything will be positive. Simplicity sake, remember lupus has got a full house pattern in immunofluorescence. This particular image has got IgM negative. A certain fraction may have IgM negative. This was because you have to know what is positive, what is negative. That is why I chose this picture. That's all. So this is what a negative looks like. This is like a positive. The most important thing which should be positive for us to call lupus is C1q. I was showing you the classical pathway involvement. Lupus is a disease which predominantly involves the class. C1q will be affected. There will be C1q deposition in the capillaries. Therefore, you will have C1q positivity. C1q, IgG, C3 positivity is what is required for us to call it as lupus. But most of the cases, you may have a full house meaning all antibodies and complements which you are using. It will stain against everything. That is the classical picture of lupus nephritis. Why we went into so much of depth about lupus nephritis is a question. So lupus nephritis, just to recapitulate the basic things, it will all be there in the textbook. There are 6 classes. One is minimal mesangial, wherein it will be totally like the normal. It will be like this. Minimal mesangial means it will be totally like this. Only in electron microscopy will you be able to make out increase in the mesangial deposits. That is class 1. Class 2 means you will have only mesangial proliferation, meaning more than 3 cells present in this mesangium. Class 3 and 4 are when you have subendothelial immune deposits like this wire loop which I showed you. Where is the wire loop one? Yeah, here. So you have got subendothelial deposition. This is seen in 3-4 along with in endocapillary proliferation. Within the capillary, you will have many neutrophils, infiltration which is present. This is seen in 3 and 4. How do we differentiate between 3 and 4 is based on how many glomeruli are affected. If in the segment, suppose let us say there are 20 glomeruli. In 20, if less than 50% are affected, we call it as focal or class 3. If more than 50%, 20 more than 50% means if you have 20 glomeruli, if more than 10 are affected, then that is what is called as diffuse proliferative lupus nephritis. How many glomeruli are affected in that particular biopsy sample. If my biopsy sample has 14 glomeruli, if less than 7 are affected, it will be class 3. If more than 7 are affected, it will be class 4. Class 5 is totally different. It is called as membranous lupus nephritis. It has got just thickened capillary walls. We'll show you one case on that when we go a little more depth in lupus. Class 5 is basically everything is sclerotic. Sclerotic, there will nothing be pink. There will be nothing blue. Everything will be pink. So completely sclerosed glomeruli without nuclei. Usually their immunosuppression will not work. They are very close to initiation of dialysis or CKD end stage. So these are the 6 classes: minimal mesangial proliferation, where you can see more than 3 cells, focal diffuse based on the number of glomeruli involved, membranous, where there is thickening of capillary wall, and advanced sclerotic lupus nephritis. Okay, that is all about lupus nephritis. This is further little more, if at all you want to remember, there is something called as activity index. There is something called chronicity index. Chronicity index are glomerulosclerosis, tubules getting atrophied, a lot of fibrosis. All these say that the disease has been present for a long term, that it is an ongoing process, and it may not respond to your immunosuppression. It is scored out of 12 based on what is the chronicity index. Chronicity index is a poor marker, poor prognostic marker. Whereas activity, we were saying hypercellularity, neutrophils, wire loop lesions, if there is fibrinoid necrosis. Fibrinoid necrosis is a type of necrosis. I don't know if you remember the pathology. Fibrinoid necrosis is a type of necrosis wherein there is, it just disintegrates into fibrin. So their fibrin stain can be done. It is thread-like structures. Fibrinoid necrosis is important. Then if you have crescents or if you have interstitial inflammation, this activity index also gets scored. There's a mistake here. Activity index is scored out of 24, not out of 12. So finally, this is how they give the report. This patient, there was double contouring of basement membrane, wire loop lesions was present, PAS positive hyaline thrombi was present. The interstitial involvement was less than 5%. This was the IF, which had everything positive except for IgA, just like I showed you in the picture. You had IgG3, IgM, C3, C1q was present. They have mentioned activity is 4, meaning there is some active inflammation still going on. Chronicity was 0, meaning that if you give immunosuppression now, there are no irreversible changes. You treat now, she is presented well within the window of opportunity. She is likely to have a good prognosis. So this was the final biopsy picture. It was lupus nephritis and the patient is on steroids and MMF. Okay, that was about lupus nephritis. The other 2 cases, any volunteers? We'll finish this class quickly. Anyone wants to come forward? Okay, this case I'll complete. This was another patient who had come to the nephrology OPD way back in Jan. She was treated in as nephrotic syndrome in 2001. Then the biopsy was probable MCNS. She was treated with steroids, but then after that, no follow-up. She was doing well. Okay, now she came in with, again, the clinical presentation was edema of 1 month duration. We worked her up for a glomerular disease etiology. Clinically, she had normal renal function, normotensive, nothing else apart from edema. Her evaluation fitted in nephrotic syndrome. When I say nephrotic syndrome, here you can see proteinuria is more than 3.5. This is the 24-hour urine protein. It was in the nephrotic range. She also had hypoalbuminemia, hyperlipidemia, edema was already present. So she was a case of nephrotic syndrome. She underwent a biopsy because earlier biopsy report was missing, and usually in the normal course MCNS is not a disease which will recur after 20 years. In 2001, even if she was treated, then she has been doing well. Yeah, her kidney function is normal. After 20 years, we wanted to make sure whether it was the same disease or a different disease. Therefore, she was biopsied. This was the picture. Let me just tell you, this is both normal looking glomerulus. This is what is called as minimal change disease. Minimal change disease means you cannot make out any change under light microscopy. The changes can be made out only under electron microscopy. You saw the podocytes, right? The podocytes will all, it will sort of fall off. It will all get, the shape will change, or they will just fall off. It will just be bland area. That is called as podocyte effacement. So in many minimal change disease in light microscopy you cannot make out. Electron microscopy is picks up that. That is why it is called as minimal change, or you cannot pick up any change. So she was there was no other pathology. It was the same disease, and she was treated on steroids. Minimal change disease. The treatment is steroids. It is usually given for a period of 8 weeks, full dose of steroids followed by a gradual tapering. Adult onset nephrotic syndrome has got a standard set of guidelines. You just treat with one agent, that is steroid, for whether it is MCD or FSGS. You can give full dose steroids up to a maximum of 16 weeks, and then there is a gradual tapering. If they attain remission, after remission, you maintain the remission for 4 weeks and then try to taper the steroids. Is it just a little bit too much to go into the treatment at the same time when we are dealing with the approach? We'll put in one class on treatment of glomerular diseases, where each glomerular disease, I'll just give one brief protocol for how to treat. Okay. Basically, remember, minimal change disease can be treated with steroids. So she was started on steroids, only one agent. Okay, last case, this I want someone to take up. I'll just call out someone who's there. Who's S16? S16 can unmute and talk, maybe introduce. Hello? Wants to be anonymous, is it? Okay, we'll ask Anirudh. Anirudh, are you there?
Hi, ma'am.
Yeah. So you want to take up this case? Just quickly, we'll finish up. We are way past our time limit.
44-year-old female, 44 with smoker, with non-diabetic, non-hypertensive, with the presented with breathing difficulty, BP 180, 100. So hypertensive. So
first tell me this patient, don't go directly into the kidney or glomerulus or anything, Anirudh. If you are there, what will you think of? See, this entire exercise is basically because we want your thinking pattern to change, not because we want to arrive at some super diagnosis at the end of the day. So what is it that you want? How will you approach if you are sitting in emergency? That's all.
like he came with accelerated hypertension.
Yes, very good. So the first striking feature is there is accelerated hypertension. Okay, because there is no prior history of hypertension. He in fact told 6 months back his blood pressure was measured for something else. Then it was normal, and now he has come in with a BP of 180, 110, and then he has got breathing difficulty. So what is your approach to someone 45-year-old who's coming with accelerated hypertension?
Like edema, pedal edema.
You leave that part. Hypertension can be primary or secondary, right?
Yeah,
so you're thinking of primary hypertension or secondary hypertension, or do you want some things to be done before you say it is primary, or how is it?
Second.
Primary hypertension, what are the features? Which normally at what age do you have primary hypertension?
Like more than, like old age, probably 60 years.
Nowadays people are getting diagnosed, even kids are getting diagnosed primary hypertension because of the lifestyle changes. Anyway, just let us keep it as 45 is not so unusual age for you to get primary hypertension diagnosed. But usually primary hypertension doesn't directly present with an accelerated hypertension. They don't come in with an emergency. Here you have breathing difficulty, right? He was actually in LVF. So primary hypertension directly doesn't present with emergencies. So primary hypertension, only 1% of primary hypertension presents as a hypertensive emergency. When you are having a hypertensive emergency, or when you see a very high diastolic BP, see DBP is 110. So these are subtle features that it could be actually a secondary cause of hypertension. Okay. And anyway, primary hypertension is a disease of exclusion. You have to rule out everything else before you say it is primary hypertension. So what are the causes of secondary hypertension? Do you know?
Like any CKD.
No. You tell me broad systems. Causes of secondary hypertension. Secondary, which all organs can cause secondary hypertension?
Like kidney, any kidney
Kidney involvement, say CKD, AKI, glomerular disease, anything. Then what can cause secondary hypertension? Can you have endocrinological?
Yeah, I'm endocrinology, steroids.
Yes, endocrinology is another system. Any other disease which can, any other system which can present with secondary hypertension?
Thyroid.
Thyroid comes in endocrine, right? Cardiology, can it come?
Yeah.
Cardiology, we'll just put heart and vessels together in that. Certain types of all these vessel involvement, whether it is vasculitis. Vasculitis can again be multiple types of vasculitis, whether it is small vessel, medium vessel, or large vessel like Takayasu. So you have got the heart and the blood vessels. That is one system which can cause. You've got the endocrinological system. That is another. The kidneys, of course, we'll go into the kidney part. Then you have got, if the patient has been on any drugs, suppose he's taking some sympathomimetics, or for some reason someone he's been on steroids. Steroids can cause hypertension, you know that, right? Steroids can cause hypertension. So drugs can cause, or any system involvement can cause the secondary hypertension. Okay, now we want to see which system has caused the hypertension in this patient. There is one clue saying that there is pedal edema. This is your next further this thing. You did urine. This is what is everything is normal. Anything is abnormal.
There is albumin 3+ with the RB hematuria microscopic.
Yeah. So it was microscopic hematuria. They also say that dysmorphic RBCs.
It means glomerular involvement.
Ideally, you should have had a percentage of dysmorphic RBCs. So percentage of dysmorphic RBCs, what is significant? What did I tell? This is just to check if people are awake or just repeat. So dysmorphic RBC percentage should be usually more than 30%. Okay. But here we were not able to measure because our lab did not support us. They just said dysmorphic RBCs are present. Serum creatinine 1.29 mg per dl. This is, what is your comment? 1.29, normal, abnormal, don't know.
Ma'am, hypertension with hematuria with probably nephritic syndrome.
Yeah, it is nephritic syndrome. Very good. So the clinical diagnosis is nephritic syndrome. 1.29 creatinine in males up to 1.3 is normal in our lab. This is a lab variation. Anyway, what the clinical syndrome which you came to was correct. It is nephritic syndrome, mainly because why we are saying nephritic, we have got hypertension first time, and we have got albumin 3+ with microhematuria and dysmorphic RBCs. Okay, what next? What else do you want, Anirudh? Any further investigations?
24-hour urinary protein. It comes like.
You want? Right. 1 second.
24-hour urinary protein.
Yeah, this is the 24-hour urinary protein. I gave some additional things also.
5 grams.
So what is it?
It is in protein. It is more than 5 grams.
It is more than 5 grams. Yeah. 5 grams.
Nephrotic.
It is somewhere between nephrotic presentation.
Nephrotic.
This is isolated nephrotic range proteinuria. Actually, lipid profile was normal for this patient. Albumin, I don't remember, but it was not typical nephrotic syndrome. I told you, right? Nephrotic syndrome means you should have everything. Protein, urinary protein should be more than 3.5 gram along with low albumin and hyperlipidemia. So here it was somewhere between the we saw one spectrum is nephrotic, one spectrum is nephritic. It is a classical nephrotic presentation. Okay. So C3
both are low.
Both are low. What are the differential diagnosis for both are low?
Lupus, MPG.
Yeah, lupus and MPGN. Someone told. Very good. So where are we with that slide? So here, low C3, low SO4. We are thinking of lupus and MPGN. Is it lupus? Is it MPGN? 45-year-old male, which one are you considering high in the list?
Lupus is more common in females, sir.
Very good. Lupus is 9 times more common in females. So it is not when you are saying a male lupus, you should actually be careful and think of everything else. So that is one thing. Anyway, in the next slide also you saw ANA is negative. ANA profile also we did for doubly sure. It is negative. So lupus is more or less ruled out. You should remember that 98% of the lupus will have ANA positive. So very, very rare, only 2% of lupus get missed by your ANA screening. So lupus is more or less ruled out. We are in the MPGN group. So agree so far that it is MPGN?
Yeah.
Okay. So we'll just come to that last slide. I'll show you the biopsy before we... Okay. The ANA was negative, ANA profile was negative. What do you see in this, Anirudh? This is the normal. This is everywhere normal is put for comparison.
Hypercellularity, proliferation, mesangial proliferation.
Yeah, mesangial proliferation is there. There is a lot of the capillary lumens are all only not made out. Both the endocapillary proliferation and mesangial proliferation. Endocapillary means within this capillary loop. See, there also you have got a neutrophil here. Here also you have almost the capillary is filled here. You also have additional mesangial proliferation. So both this area is mesangial proliferation. This area is referred to as endocapillary proliferation. So you've got both endocapillary and mesangial hypercellularity. This is a closer view. This is the lumen, capillary lumen within which there are cells. This is the mesangium within which there are cells. Okay. This is the IF. Read the IF. Anirudh? IF is positive for? Positive for IgG and positive for C3. C3. Okay, now we are thinking of MPGN. MPGN is correct. IgG and C3 are present. Now we'll just go back. See this slide, MPGN is not a diagnosis. You can't stop at this level. You have to think once it is MPGN, you have to see what is the further thing. Okay, this was what we were telling MPGN, how to further work up. Once you say MPGN, whether IgG is a immunoglobulin, C3 is complement. Those two were positive. If there is only complement present, it comes in this heading. It is negative for both IgG, both C3 means it goes here. Which category does this patient come in?
IgG positive, complement negative.
The complement may be positive or negative. This is plus negative or minus. Okay. Yeah. So this is positive immunoglobulin, positive complement for this patient. Okay. Meaning this disease is immunoglobulin and immune complex mediated. In this group, let me tell you, there are 4 diagnoses only. One is this monoclonal gammopathy. Monoclonal gammopathy, as in particular kappa lambda, that can cause. They will have only one type of immunoglobulin which is present. Then the huge chunk is actually infections and autoimmune diseases. And as always, when we don't know anything, we will label it as idiopathic. So these are the 4 diseases for this patient. We went back, asked the history, examined the patient. He had pyoderma scars over the lower limb that had happened over the past, I think 3-4 months. I've forgotten the exact duration. So it was thought to be HIV, HBsAg, HCV was negative. ASO could have been done, but it is not of a high diagnostic value when you're doing it 2 weeks after the skin inflammation has started. That is why ASO titer was not done. And autoimmune diseases, we had already ruled out by saying that ANA is negative, ANA profile is negative. It was concluded as likely post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis, and because of which he had an MPGN. For your information, post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis is generally presents only with isolated C3 low. In this patient, the confusing picture was both C3 and C4 was low. That happens only in 10%. It is not that it won't happen. Everything is, there is very few not happening in medicine. It is all in terms of percentages. So post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis, the classic teaching is only C3 is reduced, C4 is normal. This patient had a very profound C3 reduction. If you see, C3 was less than 15, whereas C4 was only borderline low. C4 was 8. That can also happen in PSGN with 10% of the patient. Was labeled as post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis based on this thing. There was no features of malignancy. There was no feature of autoimmune diseases. And there was clinically that was, I should have taken a picture, that was very classic that he had pyoderma scars. So the treatment for PSGN is control of the disease, one, or treatment of the infection. Second is between children and adults. I think you have come across only when you are doing your UG days. Children are very common to develop post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis. They have a different manifestation and their prognosis is very good. Adults comparatively have a less favorable prognosis. PSGN or PIGN or IRGN are different terminologies for the same disease. Adults can be treated with a small course of steroid, small course meaning 2 to 4 weeks of steroids. The prognostication will depend based on how much of proteinuria is present and how it comes down. So this patient, when he comes for follow-up, I'll let you know how much he has improved. Otherwise, his blood pressure was controlled. He was started on ACRB inhibitor additionally for control of proteinuria, and he was started on Vizalone 1 mg per kg. Plan is to give it only for 2 to 4 weeks and to follow him up on OPD basis. Any questions about this case?
Nothing, ma'am.
Okay, fine. So that we come to the end of this glomerular diseases. Basically, what we have covered is how the glomerulus functions, the anatomical part, then the physiology of the glomerulus, the physiological equivalents, how it get manifested in glomerular diseases. Then I've tried to speak a little bit in proteinuria, hematuria, that went a little high because of that itself being questions, and then a few cases to see how to approach glomerular diseases. Any questions, please unmute and ask me. Or you can also type in the chat box. Let me stop recording.